Thank you very much, Paul. It's quite an act to follow. Thank you very much for that very interesting and detailed introduction to what's happening in Japan. So good evening, kia ora, annyeonghaseyo. I am Ardi Barnard. I've just come back, as Paul said, from 4 years in Korea. And it was a very interesting posting. You know, it started off with fire and fury and issues with North Korea. It then progressed into the great year of the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics and Summitry and all that sort of thing. 2019 was a fantastic year for New Zealand. We had visits by the Minister of Trade, the Foreign Minister and the Governor General to Seoul, and we thought this is how 2020 was going to continue. Little did we know that that's not quite how things were going to develop. And I still remember in sort of about, I think it was late February 2020, I went along to the Four Continents ice skating competition, and the first cases had just started coming out in Seoul, and we all wore masks for the 2 days or 3 days of the event. And it was a very strange feeling having a stadium full of people all wearing masks watching ice skating. And again, a feeling that kind of I wish I had now sometimes, because you know those kind of events just aren't taking place. I'll talk this evening briefly about Korea's journey with COVID and its strategy for dealing with the pandemic. Then briefly about sort of the current situation and the vaccine strategy. And then at the end, touch on the economic outlook and how things are looking over there. So Korea was one of the first economies that was hit by COVID after China, and since then Korea had 3 waves, as we saw in a lot of other countries around the world too. It never had lockdown, and I think that's a key difference between Korea and many other places. There was never a lockdown in the way that you saw in other countries. Each time there was an outbreak, the Korean government responded with tightened social distancing rules and very effectively curbed the rise in cases. And what they did was target specific vectors of infection around that time. So whether it was church services, nightclubs, cram schools, call centers, etc. And as you can see from the graph, it was quite an effective approach in sort of turning that rise in cases. But each time it reached a new plateau, and there was this gradual sort of increase in what became the new situation normal, and something we kept describing as a stubborn tail that you ended up with. And if you compare Korea with Japan, it was a very similar pattern of peaks and troughs. And looking at that graph, you know, Korea's done quite a lot better than Japan at managing the outbreaks, but Japan also has a population about 1.5 times the size of Korea. So, but even accounting for that, especially over that November-December period, things seem to be going much better in Korea. And so again, just to reiterate, there was no lockdown ever in Korea in the way that we had elsewhere, but they had very strong and, like Japan, advisory measures in place. So wearing masks almost everywhere. When I left Korea in February, I was wearing a mask in the office and arrived here to the America's Cup down on the viaduct, and it was such a change and an adaptation to be down there. It's actually quite disconcerting that first time that you're with people and you hear somebody sneeze and you sort of try and duck for cover after such a long time having that shield of a mask in front of you. They've also, though, had very strict social distancing rules in place, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next bit. But you know, things like not being able to meet with people more than 4 at a time. So groups of 5 or above were banned. And that's still in place. It started, I think, in late November, which really put a curb on socializing, Christmas parties, New Year parties, etc. And the other thing I think that very quickly developed were innovative ways of social distancing. So the plastic barriers on dining tables at restaurants, or separating different groups. Towards the end of last year, there were a number of conferences on again, and you would go along and sit in a little sort of plastic cubicle and have a meal or speak from behind that cubicle. It was a very strange experience and made selfies very, very difficult. The Korean approach to dealing with COVID was, they quickly coined this phrase of test, trace, treat, which has been the underpinning for their approach to COVID over the last 14 months or so. The first thing is Korea rolled out testing quickly and broadly, and it's available for free at government facilities. You can also get on-demand tests at private hospitals and universities, which is being used quite regularly now for pre-departure testing, because you can get a certificate in English and so on. They also introduced innovations around testing. So they were the first to introduce drive-through testing, where you could drive your car into a little booth, get a swab through the window, and off you go. And also, towards the end of last year, putting testing stations at major transport hubs. So in the morning, on the way into work on the train, you could stop off at the testing station and get swabbed. And I think as of 31st of March, so today, they've done 7.7 million tests in Korea. It's a population of about 50 million, but only 1.3% have been positive. 103 cases positive. So broad testing, fast testing. The second bit of that is tracing. So once you identify a confirmed case, they very quickly brought to bear a lot of technology to find out who the close contacts were. So unlike in Japan, they have a QR code based on a phone, and that's linked to your Katok social media sort of app. And so at every restaurant or shop or so on, you can scan in using that QR code. They also use credit card information, so to track where you've spent money, use mobile base station information to track which areas you've been in, and then use CCTV footage really effectively to identify if you were in a restaurant who was sitting around you at that time. So very quick tracing and use of the public messaging alerts to alert people to locations and times that have been that had somebody who was infected and potentially contagious. Then the third part was the treatment. So unlike in New Zealand, for example, and elsewhere, all confirmed cases went into a government facility. So whether you were symptomatic or not, whether you were serious or not, you went into a facility. This quickly overwhelmed the available beds, and so they created a two-tier triage system whereby they had these things called living care centres, which were effectively a place that you could put people, isolate them, and monitor them, but you didn't have all of the things that go along with a hospital in that location. So anybody who was not serious went into one of those facilities, and serious cases then went to hospital. And Korea very effectively ramped up its hospital bed capacity to cope with surges through those three periods. And there's an interesting bit too about public versus private hospitals, where a lot of the hospitals in Korea are private, and yet the public ones are the ones that provide this a lot of this treatment. Okay, and I've talked about so again, just there was no lockdown, but these measures have been really effective in keeping the infections down. At this point, social distancing remains in place, and those have been rolling over since probably about November, including this rule about no more than 5 people in a group. I see that's been extended, I think, till the 11th of April at least, and Seoul is what they call level 2 of a 5-tier, so that's level 3 of a 5-tier system, and the rest of Korea at level 1.5. But even if you get to the highest level, it's never a lockdown situation. It's sort of maximum social distancing instead. And part of that has been to keep the economy going. They've been very focused on keeping businesses open, putting the emphasis on the individual rather than shutting down the economy. And as a result, the Korean economy has actually fared much better than others. This last year, it contracted 1%, which is partly to do with the ongoing economic activity, partly government support, which accounted for about 14% of GDP, and also strong exports during the last quarter. So this was the best, or at least the least worst growth rate in the OECD last year. However, for Korea, it was still the worst growth rate since the Asian financial crisis in 97, so 98 since then, and a number of economies outside the OECD did better. Taiwan, Vietnam, China, and Turkey, for example. As in a lot of other countries, the tourism and travel sector was probably the hardest hit, although freight has really buoyed the Korean Air flights and kept a lot of those going. But many domestic industry services have in the services sector have shut down. And this is particularly evident when you walk around Myeongdong and Itaewon. So Myeongdong is the area where all the Chinese and Southeast Asian tourists go to experience K-pop, K-cosmetics, K-fashion, and that's empty. And a lot of shops are, boarded up and available for rent. So that's been very visible. So I think so even if the big companies can keep going, they've got the resources, they've got the means to keep trading. SMEs have been hard hit, and especially these very small sort of mum and dad type restaurant operations. And in Itaewon, which if you watch Netflix, there's an Itaewon Class series. It's a very vibrant part of the Korean nightlife scene. That's also been very empty over the last year and a half. At the same time, some of this activity has shifted online, as we've seen in many other economies around the world. So the non-face-to-face sector has done well in parts. There's been a boom in online consumption, including streaming, ebooks, virtual reality, etc. There was a set of statistics out recently that showed searches for the term ebook increased 65% over the last year, searches for VR 26%. And we've also seen a shift in investment. So investment into logistics and sort of freight forwarding type operations has doubled over the last year, and a lot more investment into smart business, supporting remote work and smart medical services. And for New Zealand companies too, that's been very good in part. So for example, last year was the best year ever in Korea for Zespri, who exported something over 10 million trays of kiwi fruit to that market. Wine, the Korean wine market increased 27% last year. New Zealand wine exports 109%. So huge growth, even accounting for a growth in the market itself. But all of that is really waiting for the vaccine. So Korea, a bit like Japan, there wasn't quite the urgency because of the cases to really fast-track a vaccine program, but they had a plan and they're rolling it out. So the Korean vaccination program started on the 26th of February, and as of 2 days ago, they've vaccinated about 1.5% of the population, so just under 800,000 people. Most of those have received the AstraZeneca vaccination, and about 60,000 got the Pfizer vaccine, with Janssen going through the approval process still. And I see on Monday, I think they passed another hurdle in terms of the safety assessment there. The vaccinations are completely free, including for foreigners. So that's a huge boost to getting the numbers up. And as you can see from when it comes up, the slide, they've also mapped out milestones out to achieving herd immunity by November, which will see a quarter vaccinated by June, about 12 million people, 70% by September, and then most likely the vaccination program will continue out into 2022 for things like revaccinations and hard-to-reach groups. As with Japan, it is a staged process with high risk, either sort of elderly people, education workers, teachers, care facility workers, receiving the vaccination first. Part of that also are military and diplomatic staff who have to travel. So I saw President Moon received his vaccination on Tuesday, the AstraZeneca vaccine, ahead of going to the UK for the G7, which is coming up soon. So Then later on, flight attendants in May, and through to, interestingly, police officers, Coast Guard, firefighters, and soldiers in June. So again, the sort of essential service type people. How are we doing for time? I think we're good. I'll just quickly. So with all of that, I think the outlook is good for the economy over the next year. They're expecting about 3% growth in Korea, and part of that is driven by the government's New Deal and Green New Deal. And perhaps later on in the questions we can talk about some of what that means for Korea and for New Zealand as well. But there are some opportunities coming out of this crisis. Thank you very much. Thanks for your attention. And I'll just leave you with this last slide. This is just a plug from MFAT for if you need a hand, if you've got an issue with business, contact us. We're there to help. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on in the question section. Thank you very much.